Good morning, everybody. I probably have had too much coffee, so I'll have similar problems, but for a different reason. My name is Kenan Gelman. Like we were talking about, I'm with the Lower Colorado River Authority. I'm very excited to share this panel with you on grid resiliency. This is an extremely important topic within the electric sector. It determines how successful you can be financially, because on resiliency basis, power plants get curtailed. There's all kinds of new challenges that are arisen. And this panel is going to kind of walk through some of those. So we're going to first talk about some of the problems and kind of lay out the issue, and one kind of case study. Then we'll kind of talk about a little bit about large loads perspective on this. From there, we're going to move to discussing renewable technologies and how they fit in and the challenges and solutions they're looking for. And then lastly, and this is a topic very near to my heart, we're going to talk about what's going on in the distribution sector and distribution level sector, so below the transmission side, and how that impacts the industry both from a positive and negative side. So Brent, why don't you go ahead and introduce the topic, and we'll go from there.
If you don't mind, I'd like to stand.
Please.
Think a little bit better on my feet. So thank you for the introduction, Kenan. I'm Brent Austgen. I'm a researcher at Sandia National Laboratories. I'm going to talk a little bit about complexity and trade-offs to kick off this panel, particularly those that arise in resilience decision modeling. So briefly, I'd like to acknowledge a few people. I'm going to tie in some concrete examples of complexity and trade-offs from a research project I'm currently pursuing on wildfire restoration. My project collaborators at Sandia are Ross Gutchamson and Audrey Das. We're doing this work in partnership with Southern California Edison, and we're funded by the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the DOE. So what is resilience? This is sort of a tricky question because I don't think that anyone has a definitive answer. At a high level, it has to do with how well can we prepare for potential disruptions, and how well can we react to realized disruptions. And I'll get a little bit more nuanced on that in a minute here. But measuring resilience, well, first I'll also add that resilience is more of an ideal than it is a goal. And what do I mean by that? So I don't know if many of you, how many of you have kids. I have two. My older son, he's of the age where it's fun to play these games with, like, what's the biggest number you can think of? And he'll hit me with $1 million, and then I'll come back with $1,000,001. So I think about resilience in much the same way. Tell me, what is the worst case disruption you can think of? Well, I'll add +1, and it never ends. It never ends. It is impossible to make the grid impervious to every disruption. And even if it were possible, I guarantee you it's going to cost you far more money than you are willing to spend to make it impervious. So it's not about making the grid resilient in an absolute sense, but there are degrees of resilience. You can make it more resilient at incremental cost. And when we're considering resilience, we also have to consider uncertainty, because disruptions, we don't know exactly how they're going to play out. So it's less about measuring something that's deterministic and more about considering possible outcomes over a wide range of plausible scenarios, some more severe, some others less. And the idea then is, over the probability distribution of outcomes, the goal of improving resilience is to take that distribution and squeeze it to the left so that the realized consequences are less frequent and less severe. So I'm going to talk about 4 different factors here today, those listed in these 3 different panels. To start is modeling infrastructure nexuses. So modern energy infrastructure, about as complex as infrastructure has ever been. There are very many dependencies that link different infrastructure systems, and not just dependencies, but interdependencies. Now, how you model those will affect your results if you, in a decision model. And maybe first I should hit on a decision model. So what is a decision model? It's a mathematical model where the variables describe decisions that someone in the real world has to make. You want to try and solve this model, oftentimes with some objective that you're trying to optimize to achieve a best result. So values that get assigned to the variables represent actions that can be taken in real life. So in these models, there are very often trade-offs between how accurately or with how much fidelity we can model the real world and our ability to solve a model. Because the more complex you make it, the more difficult it is to get a solution out of the model. And of course, when you have very many systems that are all connected, interconnected, the more details you add to the model, the more difficult it's going to be to solve. The more detail you add to how those systems interface, the more difficult it's going to be to solve. So there's this trade-off in modeling fidelity and tractability. You'll note here I have all sorts of different infrastructure systems on the perimeter of this illustration, but at the very middle, it's no coincidence that I have society, right? Because we have to bear in mind that infrastructure is designed by people for people. So it's always important to consider the impact of disruptions on society. Of course, it's very difficult to model. It's difficult to model these systems under normal conditions. But then when you add in a threat, like a wildfire or a cyber attack, understanding how that affects individual systems can be very difficult, of course. And then understanding beyond that how a failure in one system can cascade to affect many other systems with potential loops cycling back. So, right, you'll notice here, there are so many more lines here than there were on the previous slide, which is indicative of the complexities that arise when you add in threats. Now, some efforts, some large-scale efforts have been made to handle this type of modeling at a large scale. For example, Helix, which was the result of the DOE-funded Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium a few years back. This is designed for simulation of infrastructures. And it allows us to include very many types of infrastructure, transmission, distribution, and it provides a decentralized cloud computing approach to simulate how these systems behave together. Now, co-simulation is one thing that's useful for evaluating decisions that are preconceived, like a strategy that's been preconceived. Determining that strategy in the first place is a little bit more difficult, and we've turned not to simulation, but to optimization or co-optimization of infrastructures. I'm not going to get into the reasons why. It has to do with like mathematical theories and everything that affects the optimization, but I'll just let it suffice to say that the optimization is a little bit trickier than the simulation. So often we have to make these sacrifices, going back to trade-offs between fidelity and tractability. So like in this wildfire application I mentioned, we're not considering, right, the kitchen sink. We're focusing on a very limited and deliberate set of infrastructures in our model, those that we believe, if we model them, will have the most impact on the results. Right, so often you would have to go to a subject matter expert to determine which infrastructure systems should you include in a model, which makes the most sense, which will best inform decision making. Moving on from that, we have threat impact. Of course, like I said, if you add a threat into your model, that increases complexity. And then for a particular type of threat, like wildfire, for example, there may be many different failure modes just for that one particular kind of threat. So again, for example, in the wildfire application, you have damages, direct damages, like distribution poles being burned, conductor transformers being damaged, things that directly affect power grid operations. Indirect, less direct effects include ash and other debris that comes off the fire and might coat insulators. And when the insulators get coated with this debris, it can lead to flashovers and faults. Road blockages, so if a fire topples a tree or a distribution pole, right, you have, it might block a road, which would prevent potentially a restoration crew from reaching a particular neighborhood to perform restoration activities. So in our model, we included the road network in our model because when roads are blocked, of course, it affects restoration activities. And then you have human factors. So will people evacuate? Does that affect how you should prioritize re-energizing sections of the grid? If a wildfire is so devastating that it destroys whole neighborhoods and communities, those are not, right, then those areas don't have to be prioritized because there's no load to serve there in the foreseeable future, in the worst cases. The third factor, decision timescale. So this illustration here is my adaptation of the resilience cycle from some National Academy of Sciences report. And it's highlighting decisions that get made at different points in time over the course of a disruption. So on the top, we have decisions that are focused on addressing a particular incident, both before, during, and after the disruption occurs. So the reason that this gets to be complex in decision modeling is first because these different, between prepare, withstand, and recover, those decisions occur on very different timescales. Prepare might be years to months in advance of a supposed or like some hypothesized disruption, whereas the withstand might be on the order of hours or days over the course of a disruption occurring. And then recover at the end might be on the order of days to weeks for restoration activities. And then at the bottom, so the top, all of these stages in the resilience cycle represent decisions that you want to include in a resilience decision model. And then the bottom, the adapt portion is like lessons learned. And how do we tweak the model in between disruptions so that the next time a disruption occurs, the model will inform better decisions. So for the wildfire application, some examples of preparation included resource staging. And bear in mind, we're considering an imminent wildfire, like a wildfire that's known to be blazing but has not yet damaged infrastructure. So these decisions are not years and weeks in advance. These are like days and hours in advance. So the time scale in our application is much smaller, but we're still covering decisions across all three of these stages. And then during the wildfire disruption, you have grid operation and maybe grid, like distribution grid, switch configuration decisions, and also after the event. And then in recovery, decisions pertaining to resource allocation and job scheduling and restoration ordering. Now, fourth on my list is uncertainty mitigation. And as I started thinking about what I was going to say for this presentation, I had some regrets about this particular phrasing. Really what I mean by uncertainty here is the extent to which uncertainty is considered in the model. If at all. Sometimes we just suppose we live in a deterministic world and that could be good enough. But a more holistic approach is always to consider uncertain factors. Very often, in normal operations, we're considering uncertainty like, how does weather affect PV solar and wind generator production? How does it affect load? Which are sources of uncertainty that I would consider aleatoric, having to do with inherent randomness in the weather, things that we can't model well. There's forecasting error and things like that. Versus epistemic uncertainty, which is much less studied in, I think, both in practice and in the research. And these include factors like impedance of transmission lines. You could measure that. It might be dynamic in time. There are all sorts of reasons why, for example, the friction factor of a natural gas pipeline could change over time. These are sources of uncertainty that could matter in a resilience application, but unless you consider them to be uncertain, you wouldn't know. And I'll just briefly say this list of techniques on the left here are all sorts of different ways that you can incorporate uncertainty, models of uncertainty in a resilience decision model. Why would you pick any one of these over the others? Well, one, going back to the trade-off of modeling complexity and modeling fidelity and tractability, some of these are more complex. Some models are more complex than others. So the deeper consideration you give to the uncertainty, the more decision variables you're going to have, the more complex they become, and the more complex the relationships become, which all leads to more difficult models to solve. And then other reasons might be that just having to do with the nature of the uncertainty. Is it having to do with weather? Do we believe that it's random? Well, then we'd want to pick a technique that accounts for that versus an adversarial threat where it's not random, like we suppose that the attacker is trying to do his best to cripple the grid. And that requires a very different kind of consideration in modeling. A less holistic way of accounting for uncertainty is rolling time horizon optimization, which is basically what's used to settle electricity markets. This could be coupled with pretty much any one of the techniques on the previous slide for a very comprehensive and holistic approach to modeling. But on its own, it does a pretty good job. And the basic idea with this is that you're iteratively solving a model and parameterizing it with the latest information you have about the state of the system and the best forecasts you have at your disposal at the time, which are presumably the most accurate. So to recap, these complexities and trade-offs, these are not just things that occur in modeling. These are real trade-offs for decision makers in the real world, right? And I'll just say that if you think you've heard this presentation before, you're right. At a high level, this probably could have applied from the past 10 years and will probably apply for the next 10 years. The specific applications will differ, but the complexities and trade-offs will persist over time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So next, I'm going to ask Mike to give his thoughts on the issue from a large load perspective. As you're probably aware, nationally and internationally, electrification of the grid is pushing kind of demand and production of electricity to the edges, and it's causing challenges for large loads. So let me hand the mic over to you.
Awesome, thanks. So hey everyone, my name is Mike. I run product and engineering for an AI cloud platform. And if you're wondering why an AI cloud platform is here talking about energy, it is because I cannot continue to build my business and fuel AI without massive quantities of energy. That's actually the main bottleneck right now in terms of creation of these large language models. To put it very briefly into context, something like GPT-5, if folks are familiar with OpenAI's ChatGPT, that's the model that they're training now. It's being trained on, let's just say, roughly 100,000 of the state-of-the-art GPUs. That's roughly a 250 megawatt data center. If you go based on these sort of scaling laws that we're seeing in AI, GPT-6 will be trained on something like 5 gigawatts of power in a data center. And that is effectively half of the world's largest power plant, which is the Three Gorges Dam. Right? So if you imagine kind of where we're going in the next few years, there aren't that many Three Gorges dams in the world. Right? And so I come, not necessarily because I want to come, but because I have customers that are saying, I want a 250 megawatt data center by the end of the year, or I want a gigawatt of power in the next 12 to 18 months. And that simply doesn't exist. Right? So I work for an international company. We have data center facilities being built in France because France has cheap, clean power via their nuclear sites that currently they're exporting electrons. They would rather export something like intelligence via AI. And so, again, I live here in Texas, and I work increasingly in Texas because, to the point here, we have to actually start moving data centers to the energy sources. Transmission doesn't exist in many cases, or for instance, it takes 4 years to get a high voltage transformer. I need to build things in less than 4 years. And so for me, going directly to a substation that exists at a wind farm in West Texas is the easiest way for me to operate. Or going and deploying 250 megawatts of natural gas turbines is the easiest way. And I don't want to do that, but I'm forced to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, the thing I would tell you is, from a resilience standpoint, the Alamo for the grid operator is to shed load. You cannot have a cascading outage, as Brent was explaining. So that also is not an attractive thing to a data center. But that's like the Alamo, the last stop, and that's what you saw during Uri and in other places around the world. Seyi, why don't you tell us a little bit about, as a renewable developer, how you see the challenges of resilience on the grid?
Yeah, so quick background, Seyi Fabode, I work with RWE. We are the third largest developer in the US, independent power provider. The US subsidiary of the German company. We have just shy of 11 gig of wind, solar, and batteries deployed across about 40 states in the US. And we're seeing a lot of demand from the data center folk you just mentioned because of the need for AI. As he was sharing earlier, you can imagine all our assets are distributed energy resources on the grid. The AI data center folk want some geographies because it makes sense to be. The reason why North Virginia is big for AI is because it's essentially you're plugging right into the internet from North Virginia. But Texas, Dallas is starting to see a lot. And all the demand for power distributed, in some cases with the centralized sources as well, is being built on top of a grid that is, for all intents and purposes, crumbling. So there's a few $1 trillion required to build a grid up to the point where it serves us well today, which means it's not as resilient as it needs to be. And we're increasing demand, about 35 gig projected for AI by 2030, which will make up about 7% of the US draw on power. We just haven't set the grid up in a way to address the demands, but also the distributed nature of the infrastructure we're putting on it. But there's also a bit of good news there, and we can get to that a bit later, in the sense that because they're distributed assets and it is not one point of failure on the grid, a distributed grid is a more resilient grid, just by the fact that you have multiple nodes on the system, and if something happens, you can localize and remove that from the central structures of the grid. So I'll pause there, but that's how we see it. Ton of demand, crumbling grid, but the benefit of more resilience coming from distributed assets on the grid, yeah.
I mean, almost every type of grid infrastructure product that you might want to buy is on back order or 2 years away. It is so that supply chain issues are a huge player in resilience and trying to solve that. So let's talk a little bit about maybe having something closer to load, closer within the distribution system, And Matthew's going to talk about the distribution, both pros and cons from a resiliency standpoint.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be here from Electric Power Research Institute. Grid resiliency has been a strong theme and a focus of ours for a number of years now. From the distribution side, though, it's relatively new. There hasn't been a whole lot of developments, prior to just 2 or 3 years ago of how do we study this? From the distribution angle, a lot of it's been based off of power flow studies, but we're looking at new types of models, similar to what Brent was saying earlier, is new ways to examine grid, new ways to examine the resiliency of these assets that are all connected together. It's a big grid. We take advantage of it being distributed, but it also means that there's a lot of challenges with that distributed grid. When we talk to our utilities, we ask them, do you know all of your assets out there in the field? Do you know how it's all connected? And they usually say, yeah, it's in our GIS. And we're like, well, let's see the GIS. Let's see, do you know the class of poles that are out there? And it's pretty sparse. There's a lot of opportunity to really go in and understand our distribution grid better. So that's one thing that we've really seen as a driving factor of we need to understand what's out there, what's in the ground, how is it connected, what's out there on the poles, how's the vegetation management going so that we know that our right-of-ways are cleared, and whenever we have this ice storm like we had a couple years ago in Texas, it's not going to fall into all the lines and bring down our distribution. Customers are connected there. That was a great point you brought up. That's where we are connected, and we want to be resilient. We want to make sure that our grid is up, we have energy flowing, we're able to actually use it when we need it most. But it's not just knowing the assets out there that are challenges. We've seen there's also challenges in just recording what's been happening. Whenever we see these major events, if we think about historical events, the crews are out there, they're making these upgrades, they're getting the grid back online as fast as they can. And with that, really creates more unknowns. What failed? Why did it fail? How could we do it better? If we can really understand why things are failing, if we can really capture that, that will allow us to build the grid more resiliently as we move into the future too. So from the distribution standpoint, once again, it's a new area of research. If there are any young engineers out there in the crowd, this is an area that's really, really getting hot. And that's going to rely on having new types of methods to assess it. AI is, something that I think can be really powerful to do these types of asset assessments, understanding these big types of storms and hazards that come through. There's so many possibilities, as Brent mentioned earlier. You can't plan for everything, but can you plan for at least enough to get yourself up to a level of feeling resilient, like you can withstand the next major ice storm or windstorm or hurricane? But there's those challenges. We need better understanding of what's out there. We need to have a better understanding of why things fail and when. And we have to have those predictions of what's going to be the future, which is a very big unknown of what may be the next big storm that rolls through, and how can we properly prepare for it. But it's an interesting area. Happy to be part of the distribution grid, but if you take one thing away from it today, there's a lot of momentum, and there's a lot of ways to make the grid more resilient from the distribution angle. And that, I'll say one more plug, distributed resources, great opportunity. Alternative energy pathways are a great opportunity. Hardening the assets that are out there are a great opportunity. Making sure we have the right plans from an operational standpoint are great opportunities to all make this more resilient.
Well, we're getting near the end of the presentation. Let me see if there's any audience questions for the panel.
I have a question for you guys. I think Mike was talking about co-location of data centers where the energy is, and one of the reasons to be in Texas. We have plenty of energy in West Texas. But my understanding is that most data centers today are near urban areas. So do you envision that in the future we're going to be able to have infrastructure in terms of fiber optics and things like that to co-locate those big data centers in the middle of nowhere in the Permian?
My very contrarian AI take on this is, how many people have used ChatGPT? Hopefully like everyone, right? It takes some time to think. It doesn't matter if you're 10 milliseconds closer or 100 milliseconds closer. It's going to take human scale time to do this. And it's actually much more efficient to build single large brains in the middle of nowhere. It turns out there's a lot of fiber. I'm looking at a site in West Texas that has 144 fiber bundle. It's yay big, that drives down the highway. And so you can tap into that and get access to it. It turns out, again, it's much harder to get the energy there than it is to get fiber optics. It's really hard to move atoms. It's somewhat hard to move electrons. It's actually very easy to move bits. And so this idea of moving the large load to the generation source, I think that's actually kind of the predominant thing in the past several years that the data centers have been going down. Again, you can get massive economies of scale of building a gigawatt facility versus going and building a bunch of 20, 30 megawatt facilities. It's a great question, though. There are some places, real-time video, or you could think like call center chat, where latency does matter, and I think we'll see more distribution there. But I think for a lot of the sort of AI workloads, they're relatively latency insensitive.
Yeah, task distribution and geographic location will start to matter a lot more. And I'll tie back to the resilience point, because if your video stops loading, but the rest of the assets in the home can provide you the safety, security, and well-being you need in these situations when we have storms and this way out there data center that is powered by batteries, and if that goes off the grid because of some unexpected event, we can still run the grid to serve people. Because at the end of the day, it's about the well-being of the people that the grid is for. The power station I worked at when I first got out of postgrad was 1,000 megawatts, 1 gig, serving about 800,000 people in London. That one same size power station is now serving 1 Microsoft data center. In my opinion, we've totally lost the plot when we do that much to serve an asset that is really, and hey, I use ChatGPT all day long, but we're converting energy into really information when we used to pay more attention converting energy into serving the well-being of people, and we seriously need to rebalance that, which will help the grid, honestly. Just, I'll get off my soapbox now. Yeah.
Carrie, did you have a question?
Well, you maybe started to answer my question, which is, do we feel like we have, this is about grid resilience, we're talking about data centers a little bit. Do we feel like the grid is resilient to data centers, and do we have the right regulations? I know there's been some rulings of, if there is a grid breakdown like EPRI or something, the data centers are going to go off, and we feel like they're not going to cause a problem. I mean, usually we think about, to some degree, grid resilience is, well, the biggest power plant, if that goes off, can the grid handle that particular disturbance? Can we handle the disturbance if a multi-gigawatt data center goes offline all of a sudden, and then that causes a similar disturbance going the other way, too much power? Do we feel like we have the right things in place for grid resilience?
I'll give a plug for EPRI here, actually. EPRI is doing a ton of really good work on data center flexibility to keep the grid resilient. So how do the data centers that are currently demand become supply when we have an emergency, especially if the power is co-located with the data center? So they're doing some phenomenal work. You should check into that, because that is a question that is on the minds of the experts at entities like this, working with industry, obviously. But yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing. I mean, We've been pretty good at developing systems to ramp up and down power plants in response to load going up or down. And it's been that order, like the power plants respond to whatever load's doing. So, I mean, there could be some frequency issues with a large load drop, but a lot of that's more developed than the opposite, which is when a bunch of power plants go down or you don't, or you lose a line or something like that. The thing I'm hopeful is data centers are actually putting in their own power, backup power. We might be able to leverage that in a resilience event to actually shed less load. So I don't know if any of you have follow-up thoughts on that, but to me, there's an opportunity there as well.
I'll just say it definitely can leverage it, but the grid still has to be operational. And if the distribution grid comes down, then you could have your source and you can't get it to your customer still. So again, the emphasis on that final step of getting that to the customer is really important.
Yeah, I guess we can use AI to model future states of more resilient grid infrastructure. At the distribution end, we're seeing a lot more. I think the base power guys were here yesterday. When you have energy storage in the homes at a scale that it starts to really have some impact, where in outages or storms, fewer rely on the grid itself, given the utility, the distribution and transmission service providers time to bring the grid back up. So I'm optimistic, very optimistic that there's enough brain power and AI power going into thinking about what is a balanced state for the grid in resilience situations. Yeah.
Mike, anything to add to that, or
Happy
Brent?
to switch to the next question. Yeah.
Go ahead. We have time. We have 3 minutes.
I guess maybe as I represent industry, I have to be like violently capitalist on this. I actually come from a company that was doing crypto mining, and that is a very curtailable load, right? If the power price is above X, turn it off. It's not going to make any money. Data centers are kind of that, though the X is much higher, right? So I was doing a little math earlier. I'm building this 20,000 GPU cluster in France. If a day of downtime of that is $2 million worth of revenue potentially lost, then we're kind of in this race to build things as quickly as possible. So there's a number that I can say, great, I will happily turn it off and go back to the grid. But that number is significantly higher given the economic value. The flip side of that is we should be able to leverage that to build a more resilient grid, given the economic value that sits on the other side, right? And so there is a really good interplay there where I am happy to make those investments. I don't want to have to buy 2N resiliency of diesel generators that are on 36-month back order, right? Like, I need to be able to leverage both my generation and the grid capacity, and so there is a really good harmony there.
Brent, any closing thoughts on your end?
I just have one point to add, which is that like this conversation definitely extends beyond just data centers and load. I feel that a lot of what people have perceived as drivers of resilience issues, which includes data centers and intermittent energy, with better control, those can be leveraged to mitigate the same problems that people have perceived them as causing, or that they have in certain cases actually caused.
Thank you. I think we've used up our time, so if you don't mind, please, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.